Boy, was that a long delay, considering I basically promised to give you the next video within 2 days. In my defense, I had to get a new audio setup, and I wanted to make sure I did some very detailed research before even covering one race, because I didn't want to not understand what one of the rules was that each of these entries cover. I apologize for that, but going ahead, we should be going strong. This video today, we'll be covering the ancestry of dwarves. Everything listed for dwarves, from their heritage choices and their ancestry feats, and we're going to kind of rate these as to what may or may not be stronger or weaker as it stands right now before other Pathfinder 2 books have been released. Some other books later on might provide context to make some of these appear better, but this is what I had to work with, so this is what we're going to be doing. Every race now has a set of hit points that it gets for choosing that race. You only get it once, and you only get it at character creation, which means at lower levels, different races will be hardier than other races, but at higher levels, the classes tend to take over. The biggest difference would be between a dwarf starting with 10 hit points and, say, I believe it was halfling with 6 hit points. That's the only difference of 4 hit points, which, since all the die increments, you know, the numbers it goes up between your squishiest, your heaviest, tend to go up in groups of 2. I'm just going to rate that in the same 2 things and put it as 2 tanky steps higher, two flesh baggy steps better if they have more health. Like I said, there is a 6, an 8, and 10, so we'll just have high health or high racial health, medium racial health, and low racial health, or we'll call the one in the middle average racial health. There is a size, of course there always is a size, and a speed. That is going to be different. The spectrum for speed tends to be between 20 and 30, though some races have an easier way to get some more speed out of that. Ability boosts, we already covered in ability scores, so I'm not really going to address any of them, including the ability flaws. Languages, I'm also not going to really cover. Races is the same as they've always been. Every race gets a free selection plus more if their intelligence is high enough, as it points out on this page. Traits, we will cover special abilities, heritages, and ancestry feats, as I already said we're going to be covering. So, for today's, our focus is the dwarves. And if any of you are a longtime follower of mine, particularly anyone coming over from Twitch, you know I love Dwarf Fortress, and my favorite race for any of these fantasy settings is always going to be the dwarves, the goblins, somebody who's more of a defensive siege type race. If someone had a campaign setting where it was the elves, who happen to be the industrious race as opposed to just the flighty magical ones, I would probably prefer the elves. But as Pathfinder 2e still appears to be following these standard things of honor and everything else for dwarves, they're my favorite race. Or second. We'll discuss that one in another video. But as we go on, skipping their society and everything, that's role-playing things. Again, you can role-play however you want. We're just going to mostly be covering the effectiveness of some of the numbers. Dwarves, as I stated earlier, start with 10 hit points. That is the beefiest any race starts with. There is another race that can start with a similar number, but they're going to have to do something. They're going to have to give up something to do that. Dwarves start with that for free. Their size is medium, though they do only have a 20-foot movement speed. This is the slowest movement speed. All the small races are 25 minimum. Dwarves have the slowest movement speed in these starting races right now. They have, for languages, Common, Dwarven, and the additionals, and then they have the traits Dwarf and Humanoid. Humanoid because, they're humanoid, and Dwarf because they're dwarf. I kind of half touched on this under the ability score video, but everything has now been boiled down to traits, keywords, things like that. As we go ahead, not necessarily just in this video, but in any other books Pathfinder 2e releases, I'm going to focus on these trait tags, because if you boil everything down to something simple, like just specific, oh, it has this entry or it has that quality, there's going to be a book where they're going to screw up. I'm not saying that, oh, they're not professional. It just always happens. There's hundreds of books that these writers have to write for in order to keep everyone buying and to flesh out their campaign. So at some point, there's going to be some screw-ups with this trait system. It's a singular point of failure. Dwarves do, however, start with dark vision. I do love this. I love it when they have dark vision. Now, we have heritages. Every race gets to choose what their heritage is. This is kind of like in Pathfinder 1st edition. This is kind of like how they would choose their archetype. And in 3.5 and later versions, this would be like, a sub-race type of thing. Basically, you're not just a dwarf. What type of dwarf are you? So some of these have really good lore, really good role-playing aspects, and some of them have really good math. It's up to you to choose what you want. If I happen to say something is bad for math, I'm not saying don't choose it. If you want to do something for role-playing, go ahead and do it. I love it when my players role-play. But remember, some of these videos are also for the DMs, so they need to keep an eye out for what their players may be doing. Just because you don't want to be a min-maxer doesn't mean you're not going to be playing with someone who does. And you've got to be aware of what the options are. First in the shoot, we have Ancient Blooded Dwarf, who gets a reaction, which says if they've attempted a saving throw against a magical effect but haven't rolled yet, they can blow their reaction to give them a +1 circumstance bonus to triggering saving throw and until the end of this turn. I really like this. This isn't a bad choice. I wouldn't call this some of the greatest options, one of the greatest options, but this is a solid choice. I do like this. My only one issue against this is that it does take a reaction. Pathfinder 2nd edition, they've crammed a lot of things under the reactions. So as we discussed under the abilities, you have the 1, 2, 3 actions, free actions, and reactions. They've crammed a lot of things under reactions. So if you have this, that's just something that's trying to take claim of a limited resource. If you are playing a class or a build that doesn't use reactions too much, this would be a stronger choice. But if you're needing someone who uses a lot of reactions, this might not be as good of a choice. In particular, fighter types, any of the melee people, tend to be able to have their reaction to do an attack of opportunity. If you're doing one of those type of builds, which might coincide with a dwarf, you're gonna get less out of this, because if you've already done an attack of opportunity or something that's taken your reaction, you won't be able to get this +1 bonus. However, in its favor, after you've triggered it once, it still applies until the end of this turn. So it's not even just for that one save. It's really good. If you're not spending those reactions, you can basically use this every turn, and at that point, it's almost an innate ability. It's almost a passive. I like it. It's just certain builds don't work well with it. Death Warden Dwarf says if you roll a success on a saving throw against a necromancy effect, you get a critical success instead. Now, Pathfinder 2nd edition, I don't have a d20 in here. Pathfinder 2nd edition doesn't use a lot of key words that I usually use as an idea of what is broken. They tend to call it something else. They legalize it. What this basically means is if you roll a success on a saving throw against a necromancy effect, you get a critical success. It basically turns any success into a nat 20, which greatly expands the chance of you getting the critical success to whatever the normal success is. Under a lot of these rolls, critical success would be getting 19 or 20, and a regular success would be getting like a 10 to 11. So this increases your critical success chance from 5 or 10% all the way to almost 50%, depending upon what your level is compared to your enemy. This is a good effect. I really like this. It is, however, a bit niche in that it's better versus necromancy effects. So if you're doing like a pirate type campaign or something that doesn't necessarily have a whole hell of a lot of necromancy, you might not be seeing this that much. It might not come into play. You're just going to figure out what your DM is going to be using. If you are a DM though, and you plan on throwing some dwarves in and you know your party has some necromancers in there, I mean, if you don't mind giving up some of the other things, this is an easy thing to try to, really lower the effectiveness of that wizard. If he's been getting too much limelight recently, you might want to, a few battles. Next up is Forged Dwarf, and I like a bunch of these. There are a bunch of races that have a similar ability to what Forged Dwarf is, which is besides something that's useful in combat, there's something that's useful for the environment, which is just fantastic. That's good for both math, role-playing. It kind of fleshes out the character. In this case, what a Forged Dwarf is, it gets fire resistance equal to half your level, minimum of 1, which means at the top end, you only get a fire resistance of 10, which at the end of the game isn't that big, admittedly. However, you treat environmental heat effects as if they are one less step extreme. Incredible becomes extreme becomes severe, and so on. What this means in terms of environments is, one, your dwarf is never going to be in an extreme area, and this also means that once everyone else starts, suffering, you won't be suffering at all, because a little bit of extreme will be reduced to not a problem in the least. So this is a pretty decent one, but again, just like the necromancy one, kind of might be a bit niche, maybe, because of the environmental half of it, and that is the stronger half of these two halves. Next up, we have Rock Dwarf. This makes you solid as a rock when you plant your feet. You gain a +2 circumstance bonus to your fortitude or reflex DC against attempts to shove or trip you. This bonus also applies to saving throws against spells or effects that attempt to knock you prone. And this is the part I like. In addition, if any effect would force you to move 10 feet or more, you're moved only half the distance. Now, any is a bit of an extreme word. It's not defined. What does that actually entail? If any effect would force you to move 10 feet or more, you are moved only half the distance. Do I only move half as far if I'm caught in a stream and I'm going downstream? It doesn't say when I'm on the ground necessarily, because it's in a different paragraph. I think they mean when you plant your feet, you would get this effect. Not completely clear though. Either way though, the ability to resist being moved is a classical dwarven trait. The ability to increase your fortitude or reflex DCs against attempts that shove or trip you could be good, could be bad. It depends on how the other thing is worded, because it specifically calls out shove or trip. If something is moving you, I could see someone arguing that something should count as a shove, but even if they're all worded correctly in this book and a future book, something might try to move you without calling it a shove. This is a nebulous thing that is as broken or as weak as the DM allows it to be, essentially. This is one of those read as written versus read as intended gray areas. And if you can get away with it, if you can get away with nothing forcing you to move if you don't want to move, regardless of that top one, or, removing you half, that makes it really good. If you are the DM or you have a DM that rules that only works when you've planted your feet, it's less useful, but still it's an okay thing. Strong-blooded dwarf. Your blood runs hardy and strong. You can shake off toxins. You gain poison resist equal to half of your level, minimum 1, of course capping out at 10. And each of your successful saving throws against a poison affliction reduces its stage by 2 or by 1 for a virulent poison. Each critical success against an ongoing poison reduces its stage by 3 or by 2 for a virulent poison. That top thing would be equaling the fire, and getting rid of poison that much faster is a pretty useful thing. Of all of these, if I were to go through these, I think one of the stronger ones is Forge Dwarf, just because of that heat. But if heat doesn't apply, then I would go with the Rock Dwarf. And if the Rock Dwarf is ruled against, then Ancient Blooded Dwarf, if you're doing a build that, doesn't do too many reactions, is pretty useful, if nothing else. The Strong Blooded Dwarf. So rogues have an ability to do lots of poison. I'll grant you that. Poison is going to be more commonplace. But really, how often is... It's such a weird new ability. I can't actually rate how powerful I think that is, because I haven't seen this in practice. This is either very good... Let me put it this way. Strong-blooded dwarf would be better in the hands of a DM, I think, than it would be in the hands of a player. If a player takes strong-blooded dwarf, the DM is probably going to start leading towards less poison. If one of your players, though, has strong-blooded dwarf, then you'd lean towards less poison. If a player doesn't, you'd lean towards more. Like, I don't know if I'm being clear on this. This is kind of one of those, I would almost call it like double bluff. You're getting an ability, or you're choosing ability purely upon, like, this affects the other person. This is always going to affect the DM. Fire, you can't really avoid fire. A bunch of creatures in the game and environments do fire. Strong-blooded dwarf, as a player, the DM, if he wants to, will just ignore that by not having poison. And if the DM... If you're the DM doing one of these, you have someone who's a strong-blooded dwarf, you'd have only chosen that if one of the players has poison. Either way, like, it's a weird thing. It counters the players more than it counters the DM. So that makes me feel a bit off on strong-blooded. I'm not saying it's not a bad choice. I just feel like it's stronger in the hands of a dungeon master, or I believe it's now called a game master. That would be all of the Dwarf Heritages that you could choose on. After this, we go into the racial feats. These are feats that you gain at first level and every 4 levels thereafter. And they're basically just ways to either build upon a heritage or to further define your race. You can choose any of these regardless of your class. It's based purely on race and level. Looking at the first level ones, we have Dwarven lore, and most every race shares this feat, so I'm not going to be able to effectively rate any of them as being a good choice or a negative choice. They're just all about neutral. Everyone has a similar type of thing, which is you can choose crafting and religion. At least for dwarves, someone else gets to choose 2 different skills. You'd automatically become trained in one of those skills. You instead become trained in a skill of your choice. You also become trained in Dwarven lore. What this basically does, if you were to try to use this to your advantage, is try to stack up your racial lore with some class lore. Because by this wording, by what it says, read as intended as well as written as far as I'm aware, if you create an overlap between your choices, you just get to choose any skill you want to be trained in. This is, you're going to become trained in one of those skills. This is crafting and religion. As long as you can grab one of those already from your class, then you can grab any skill you want to be trained in, even one that wouldn't necessarily make sense for your class. And being able to have choices, it's always a good option in my opinion. Not necessarily the best, but for every race, that's an idea to keep out of. If you have nothing else, try to see if you can sync those up and get a free skill out of it. Dwarven weapon familiarity. Similarly, this is going to be duplicated across most to all the other races, which is any weapon that has your racial attribute, in this case, Dwarven weapons, are going to be easier for you to learn. Martial becomes simple and advanced become martial. In addition, you automatically become trained with certain weapons that are cliche for your race. There will be feats that build upon this. Every race has that. It's just tied to those weapons in general. I was rate all that as neutral. Rock Runner. You can ignore difficult terrain caused by rubble and uneven ground made of stone and earth. In addition, when you use the acrobatics skill to balance on narrow surfaces or uneven ground made of stone or earth, you are not flat-footed. When you roll a success at one of these acrobatics checks, you get a critical success instead. On one hand, this sounds like it would be really good for a dwarf just being in uneven terrain. Like that's what most people would assume for, because a dwarf, they're sure-footed. That makes perfect sense. I like this for that balance check, though. This is a real good one for rogues, because rogues are going to be doing acrobatics. Because here's the thing. It says balance on narrow surfaces or uneven ground made of stone or earth. How many times is there some ravine or crevice or something that is going to be based on stone? Even if you're trying to climb or scoot around on a castle, most castle is stonework. I could see the argument that masonry, because it doesn't say natural, would be stone or earth. This is real good for a bunch of rogues, just purely for the acrobatics, because all successes become crit successes, and you aren't flat-footed. So it's really good for AC. The uneven ground one, that's real useful. I'm not saying it's not. But of those two things, I would say it's stronger for the acrobatics than anything else. Next up, we have Stone Cunning. You gain a +2 circumstance bonus on perception checks to notice unusual stonework. This applies to checks to discover mechanical traps made of stone or hidden with stone. If you are not using the seek action or searching, the game master automatically rolls a secret check for you to notice unusual stonework anyways. This check does not gain a circumstance bonus, and it takes a -2 circumstance penalty instead. So this is both a source of argument and a slightly overpowered ability. There have been this type of ability has been mentioned before in other games and stuff, and there's always a bit of contention because they always word it like they word it here, and there's never a restriction listed on it. So it says if you are not using the seek action or searching, they automatically roll a secret check for you to notice it anyways. How long, or how many times, how often do they make that check? If I just stand around this secret door, do I get a check every round? If this takes no action, do I get one a turn? Do I even get a hint that maybe I should do a regular action to try to make up for it? This is powerful in that because of action economy, you're not having to use up an action or to waste any time saying you search for it. There's a chance that the game master does it for you. But the problem is this entire rule is a bit of a he said, she said type of situation, which is It's the game master. The game master does the roll for you behind the scene. And if you fail, they don't tell you they made the roll. So if the roll is unsuccessful, you as a player will always feel a bit cheated. Like you're like, oh, but if I had made the roll, it would have been good. You know, that type of thing. This applies to things like will saves and stuff. But a lot of times, if you succeed at a will save, you feel something happen. Like, you know that the game master did a roll for you. If you say, hey, I'm going in, over here and, into the woods, and the game master starts rolling things, you're probably, doing a spot or something check. Or what is it now called? Passive perception. You get the idea of what's going on. But with some of these rules, when it's like this, there always opens up the point of argument. So I would say, as written, this is slightly, it's a good solid choice. It's definitely like up in the range of a green color. It's definitely pretty good. However, in practice, this routinely leads to arguments. At least I've always seen it either in my games that I've DM'd or games I've played in where someone else was DMing, where somebody had I'm supposed to do it automatically. Well, I rolled a thing. Yeah, but we camped there for 8 hours. I only had a chance to notice the door once. So again, this is how much do you have faith in your game master? And if you're the game master, be prepared, like maybe behind the scenes fudge it a little bit in the player's favor. At least once near the beginning, make it successful. This is basically what you need to do is you have to set the precedent that if they pass that roll, you're going to give them the roll. If they have this ability and 3 times it comes up and all 3 times when you do the roll without telling them and your defense is, oh, I rolled it and you failed, completely assuming it's true, the player's not going to have faith in you. So it's kind of a weird one. I would suggest, if you're a game master, to overcome that. Near the beginning, if you have a dwarf who has this ability or any other auto spot things, throw in a couple. Throw in a couple so that they feel like set the precedent. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, look, you spotted this, you spotted this. Have something not that important, like something useful but not that important behind the door, something in question. But if you don't set that, then the player's going to feel cheated, unfortunately, even if everything being completely fair, the rolls just weren't that good, particularly because of that penalty. Unburdened Iron says you get to ignore the reduction to your speed from any armor you wear. This doesn't call out necessarily any reduction in speed from being weighed down or anything. And before, this is the way it used to work previously too. And it does have a secondary thing, which we're going to get into in a second. This first core one is the way it kind of used to work before, but dwarves weren't necessarily already the slowest damn race because of it. They were just slower than the fast ones. You're now slower than the small creatures, which means this is kind of a necessity. Because if your armor can slow you down afterward, because it used to just be passive, if your armor can slow you down afterwards as well from already being 20, you're going to have a bad time. In terms of a benefit ahead of this, though, it does address the encumbered condition, which is if you do get penalized, it subtracts 5 feet from that penalty, but it only does this once. It's an okay bonus. All right, I'll give you that. That's an okay one, but because the first one's already a prerequisite, the only time you wouldn't do that is if you were a type of class who didn't wear the type of armor that would give you a penalty. In which case, maybe you don't want to take this, because then that second part by itself isn't that great on its own because you're already slow anyways. You aren't going to get there in any reasonable amount of time. So this is either a necessity or a maybe look over feat, depending upon what class and or build you're going with. For the last first level feat, we have Vengeful Hatred. Choose one of the following Dwarven ancestral foes, and you gain Vengeful Hatred versus them. Drow, Durgar, Giants, or Orcs. You gain a +1 circumstance bonus to damage with weapons and unarmed attacks against creatures with that trait. If your attack would deal more than 1 weapon die, as is common at higher levels than first, the bonus is equal to the number of weapon die or unarmed attack die. They've done a change to the combat system. They've simplified a lot of the weapons to just being 1 die. Then you need to do something like a striking rune or whatever to double the amount of dice that you are rolling. What this means is flat out, you're not going to be getting a whole hell of a lot out of this. Later on, it would stack. You can always choose a first level feat at a higher level. At that point, it might be more worthwhile. But at first level, this isn't adding that much damage. You're already behind the curve, and it would take you a lot of hits for this one to really add up. It has its purposes. I just don't think it's as strong as it thinks it would be for the level you can take it at. In addition, if a creature critically succeeds an attack against you and deals damage to you, you gain your bonus against them for 1 minute, regardless of whether or not it is of one of the races of the race you chose. That's an even worse idea. You're already limited, as I already said, but now it only works if they critically hit you. It's not that much of a comeuppance. There are other better choices underneath the first level list that I would suggest instead. I do like that they call out your GM can add appropriate creature traits to the ancestral foes list to your characters from a community that commonly fights other types of enemies. Not arguing that. I do like that they put that in there to point out to you that that can happen. As a game master, though, you should, your game master should be willing to meet you halfway on any similar type of rule anyway. If it doesn't necessarily call out something, you should be able to, if the lore allows it, convince your game master to allow it to apply to something in particular, if it makes sense for the lore. For 5th level abilities, if we chose Rock Runner earlier, which I had at that point said was really good for rogues, it was okay for everyone else, but the focus point for that particular one, in my opinion, was better for rogues. If you choose that at this level, you can choose Boulder Roll, which allows you to take a step, which is an action to basically do a 5-foot step without an attack of opportunity, into the square of any foe that is your size or smaller. You're medium size already, so that's pretty decent. And ignoring anything that increases your size later on. So already decent. And the foe must move into the empty space directly behind it. The foe must move, even if doing so places it in harm's way. The foe can attempt a fortitude save against your athletics DC to block your step. If the foe attempts a saving throw, unless it critically succeeds, it takes bludgeoning damage equal to your level plus your strength modifier. If the foe cannot move into an empty space, your boulder roll has no effect. So there are a lot of things to take in with that one. First of all, already really good. I'm liking it. Admittedly, it does take 2 actions, but no attack of opportunity, and you are forcing your opponent to move back. At this beginning part here, there's no roll on your part. There is none. That's fantastic. If they want to avoid this, like you're pushing them in a fire, you're pushing them off a cliff or something, because it says even if doing so places it in harm's way, they can do an athletics DC or a fort save versus your athletics DC to block your step. Because this would be based off of your athletics, you're going to want to have a high athletics in this case. Remember, that's athletics, not acrobatics. I like this. This is really good ability. Admittedly, this roll is more in your opponent's favor. All things being equal, because of the proficiency system, they're going to need to roll a 10 or 11 or higher to counter this, which is about a 50-50 coin flip. That critical success is not likely to come up, except in cases of if you're the dwarf getting moved type of thing. Or no, that was something else entirely. Sorry. It's not likely to come up too often. My point being, even if they do this, though, this means that they take bludgeoning damage equal to your level plus your strength modifier. So it's kind of a gamble where you force them to take the roll, but it generally ends up in your favor. Either I push you and do guaranteed doom. Why else would you be pushing them? You can make a roll, and unless you do really good at that roll, I get to hit you anyways. Sure, the weapon might have been doing more damage, but this is on your end. You need to roll so high to make sure I don't do damage with this, and then if you fail, I get to put you in a good position, and because you attempted it, I do damage. This is really good in roll away situations. Going with the name Boulder Roll, this is good if you're already snowballing in the fight. Because what this means is, as the opponent, whoever you're going for, his health is lower, if you're the DM using it on a player, if you're a player using against one of the DM's creatures, they're less likely to want to take that roll. If their health is too low, and that's because that's not a die roll, that's a guaranteed amount of damage. Like it's not a variable thing here. So if their health is at around what that is, That's a massive gamble because whoop-de-doo, they succeeded at the roll, you didn't move them, and then they die because of the bludgeoning damage. You can use this to quite literally pressure an opponent. So either you're moving where I want you to, or I might just kill you on accident. It's not even the movement that is the good thing here. It's that guaranteed they need a critical success to not take the damage. And so they don't do the roll if their health is low. They don't do the roll, you move them where you want. This is a great player on DM or DM on player bluffing mechanic. Do you want to take that roll? Do you feel lucky this day? I love this ability. I really love this ability, and it worked well with Rock Runner. Though remember, Rock Runner was based upon acrobatics most of the time, and this new one is based upon athletics. Two different abilities. Don't make that mistake when building your character. Lastly, for level 5, we have Dwarven Weapon Cunning, which is the build-up for that Dwarven Weapon Familiarity that I previously discussed, which basically just says, when you critically hit using a battle axe, pick, warhammer, or any dwarf weapon, you apply the weapon's critical specialization effect. I'm not going to be covering them in detail in these videos in terms of races. I will when I get to equipment, but basically every armor and every weapon now has some like master trained effect, where if you're good enough with it, in this case for weapons, when you critical, you get an extra effect on top of it. That's what this does. It lets your weapons have an extra effect. Is that good for level 5 feat? You do have a couple of feats later on to be taken for this. If you're going down a weapon build already, sure, this could help. I would say, though, between the chance of this coming up useful or that boulder push thing, I would go for boulder roll. That just sounds way better, in my opinion. And remember, even if you're not a build that has athletics, if you do a class with a race that overstacks, then you can be trained in athletics because you got to just choose a skill of your choice anyways. That does put your skill feat choice for this one back one by doing that because you would have had to have taken that other slot. But, At 9th level, we only have 2 choices. And remember, for any of these, you can choose that level feat or any one lower. This is not necessarily an either or at these level points. Your choices are Mountain Stoutness. Your hardiness lets you withstand more punishment than most before going down. Increase your maximum hit points by your level. This is the equivalent of the Toughness feat. You also decrease the DC of recovery checks when you have the dying condition by 1. The DC, I think, is default to 15, which means you need a 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, or 20 to pass, which is only a 30%. Accepting, of course, that if whatever your dying thing is gets added to the DC, so it actually goes up by 1, so you only have a 25% chance. This brings it back in your favor a little bit. Free toughness feat, basically genius. If you also have the toughness feat, however, the hit points gained from it and this feat are cumulative. That's the part I like. Not only is this a free toughness feat, it stacks with the toughness feat. Because this is an extra amount of hit points by your level, this means for 2 feats, by the time you're level 20, regardless of your class, you have an extra 40 hit points. The squishier you are, the juicier that bonus is. Most every step you go up for a lot of these classes, you gain 2 hit points per level. 20 levels, 2 hit points, 40. What this basically does is this brings you from what used to be the equivalent of a D6, D8, D10, D12, up 1 die. So if you're a squishy wizard D6, which, by the way, you don't roll in classes now, it's just whatever that number was, so it's going to be 6 plus your con. This now, between those 2 feats, treats you as the equivalent health of a ranger at 8. If you're at that, you become the equivalent of a fighter at 10. If you're a fighter at 10, you become the equivalent of a barbarian at 12. And if you're a barbarian at 12, really at this point, you're just adding insult to injury just to make sure you have that much health over everyone else. The fact that you can take both of these is really good. And then lastly, you decrease the DC of recovery checks by 4. That is really golden because dying in this game is now set. The deck is stacked against you as a player. That is a really, really good one, both in terms of health and not dying. Both of those individually, I would suggest you pick up at some point. Together in 1 feat, it's just the cherry on the cake. I would suggest that. Stonewalker. You gain Melon the Stone as a 3rd level divine innate spell that you can cast once per day. If you have the Stone Cunning Dwarf Ancestry feat, you can attempt to find unusual stonework and stonework traps that require legendary proficiency in perception. If you have both Stone Cunning and Legendary in Perception,
When you're not seeking and the GM rolls a secret check for you to notice unusual stonework, you keep the bonus from stone cutting and don't take the -2 penalty. So, there's a bit to unroll from this, and it's just not as good as the previous feat. This allows you to detect traps or doors and stuff like that that you wouldn't normally be able to do. All right. Are you actually that skilled, though? It doesn't say that you're legendary or anything. It just says that you are now allowed to do rolls as if you were. Those are differences of 4, 6, and 8 if you don't have the right things. So you could be behind the times anyways. And then at this case, you have just such a horrible, nasty penalty to noticing them, not even counting the fact that you don't have the -2 circumstance, that this is against you. It doesn't add up. You could be, there's a chance, unless your perception's good enough, there's a chance that you could end up 4 behind. Even if you have that +2 bonus, you're still 2 behind. Even with getting rid of this penalty, if you have this, whatever. This bottom one, you need legendary, so you don't have to worry about it. In this extreme case, yeah, okay. But then at the end of the day, you're still back to that old, did he really though? Or would it have ruined the plot if he let me notice what was behind that door? It's a good feat. It's a good rule set. It's just routinely, this is going to lead to strife in the group. This is very good. Inarguably, this is very good. This can lead to situations where there's disagreement between a player and a DM and grind the entire momentum to a halt. I would suggest Mountain Stoutness. While it is a good feat, I would suggest against Stonewalker. Just because you're always going to have those moments of doubts. 13th level and the end for the dwarves, you get Dwarven Weapon Expertise. Whenever you gain a class feature that grants you expert or greater proficiency in a certain weapon, you also gain that for battle axes, picks, warhammers, and all dwarven weapons in which you are trained. So basically, if you go 3 feats in, even if your class isn't giving you anything to those particular weapons, you get to apply them to your weapons anyways. That being said, though, you need to go 13 levels in before you finally get the ability added to one of your dwarven weapons. If you're 13 levels in, you're probably using a different weapon because you would have wanted that class feature anyways. Either that or you were using the dwarven weapon already and you were missing out on some class features, in which case definitely grab this. I'm not saying don't grab it, but there was a period of time where you weren't getting all your class features. So this is like balancing out a voluntary nerf you were taking. I'm not saying it's a bad feat, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying it's a weird circumstance that you need to find yourself in. You're going to be taking these 3 things, and then for it to really shine, you needed to have been doing this with a class that wasn't giving you those bonuses to the weapon you were using. I don't think that's going to happen. I feel like if someone's taking the first 2 feats, they're going to have taken a class feature that would apply to those weapons anyways. So it's a weird one. Like if somehow you are in this gap, yeah, it's necessary. If you find yourself in that gap, I just don't think many players are going to find themselves in this gap where somehow they have a very awesome class feature that's not applying to the weapon that they've been using for 4 levels. Yeah, 4, 9 to 13. I do not see that coming up. Might come up, but I don't foresee it. That brings us to the end of the Dwarven video. Now, I've done a bunch of major things. We should start being able to get the videos out a lot better now. I got to do some tweaks. I've got a new mic, a new audio setup. Should be able to get clear, concise audio to you guys. If any of you have seen my Thea 2 videos, especially some of the recent ones, the voice quality hasn't been consistent, and that's what I had to get a new mic to work against. That being said, though, thank you all so much for watching. Give this video a like. Like, give it a big old thumbs up. That way we can definitely show up high in the metrics, so we can just educate everyone on this new rule system. And definitely click that subscribe button so that you can get all my videos as they come out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.